Hello everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Operational Leadership and Critical Risk Management. My name is Cassie Bolter and I'm the Events and Partnerships Manager at Centus. Today's presenter, we have Thibaut Vincent, Principal Consultant with Centus. Thibaut is experienced in large-scale end-to-end safety culture transformation projects across industries and has provided consultancy to numerous organisations around the areas of safety, human factors, leadership and cultural change. Just before we get underway, please note we are unable to hear you during the presentation. So if you have any questions, please enter them into the question box. And if we have time, Thibaut will address them at the conclusion of the webinar. Thanks again for joining us. I'll now pass over to Thibaut.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Cassie. Really excited to be here today to talk to you about the role of operational leaders in managing critical risk. It's a very exciting topic that we know a lot of people are interested in, and that gets a lot of traction recently, so really excited to be here today. Before we jump into today's presentation, probably a brief introduction to who we are. Centus as an organization. We are a safety management consulting firm, really, based in Australia out of Brisbane, and our mission is to change the lives of individuals and organizations for the better every day. And the way we do this is through the application of psychology and neuroscience to the safety context of organizations. Today, we'll be looking at a few topics, and that's our agenda for this webinar. We'll start with looking at the concept of critical control assurance, what that means, and why it's important that we focus on this as organizations. We'll then dive into the psychology of risk, the role of the leader in managing critical risk, and practical tips for operational leaders in the context of critical risk management. So let's get started with critical control assurance. Before we dive into this section, I thought it'd be helpful to probably provide a little bit of an anchor around some of the language we're going to use today and the terms that I'm going to be throwing out there and what they mean. So first, critical risk. Critical risk are the unwanted events that have the biggest potential to cause serious injury or fatality. These are the things we want to avoid. And that's why we put critical controls in place, or controls in place. Critical controls are identified and put in place to manage those critical risks. And when they're implemented effectively, this control either mitigate unwanted events or prevent them from occurring altogether. I think it'd be helpful to reflect on the definition of control that the ICMM uses. It says that a control is an act, an object or a system intended to prevent or mitigate an unwanted event. Thus, making a critical control a control is crucial to preventing or mitigating the consequences of an event, and the absence of failure of a critical control will significantly increase the risk exposure of the business, despite the existence of other controls. So I think it's good to think of critical controls as your last line of defense in a way. So what is critical control assurance? Well, I think the opportunity in critical control management in organization out there today is ensuring that the controls they've put in place are effectively implemented by the workers that are going to perform the work and systematically verified by the leaders. Hence, you need to have both leaders and team members capable and confident enough to verify controls, on top of being enabled to verify controls in order to reduce your business risk exposure. So this confidence and capability to manage high-risk work and manage them effectively is what we would call critical control assurance. Now that these have been laid out, probably helpful to reflect on what we call our safety culture model at Centus, because I think it overlays nicely with this concept of critical risk management. What this model speaks to is the idea that in any safety cultures, there's 4 overarching dimensions or micro themes, which are your environment, your practices, your person and leadership component that need to be invested in equally for organization to effectively manage risk and create a strong safety culture. What's interesting, I think each factor or each of those themes in the safety culture model plays a role in the effective critical control assurance concept. And we thought it'd be helpful to overlay this to give you a bit of a macro understanding. So mature organizations seek to achieve alignment between all components of the safety culture model to effectively manage risk. When we look at practices, what we talk about is essentially the way you codify safety in the organization. So in the sense of critical control assurance, it's probably the process that you have to capture event data, some of the mechanism you would have to accurately classify safe event, whether actual or potential. In the context of the environment, it would be most likely things like physical barricading, PPE, engineering solution to reduce risk or control risk. At a person level, we'll be exploring the attitude that people have toward risk, their willingness and ability to verify critical controls, but also their willingness to stop work if they identify that something's not being controlled. For leaders, it's probably that confidence to supervise high-risk work and the ability to identify potential events that are a safe potential event, but also the understanding of high-risk work when it comes to the way it's verified and their willingness to share their learnings. Look, what this serves to illustrate is probably one thing that I find really important to mention in the context of implementing an effective critical control program or critical control assurance is what we realized through this model and also the definition of the ICMM is probably that controls aren't really standalone, or they're not in their own right going to control or prevent an event. So, a fall restraint harness, for instance, will fall under the environment component, but that in itself, in isolation, isn't going to prevent an event from occurring. It needs to be verified, person needs to be trained. So what I'm trying to get at is that there's an interaction between all these components that will create or introduce variability, especially when controls are reliant on humans. And the more reliant they are on humans, the more variability is introduced. And you could say the less reliable they become. Now, on the other side of the coin, humans are also the one able to make decisions when circumstances aren't suiting anymore the rule that's been established. So it mostly introduces variability, which reinforces the idea that the person and leadership component of that model need to be effectively trained in managing critical controls and understanding the risk effectively. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask you a question. And that question, Cassie, should come up on people's screen shortly. So what proportion of critical controls at your site or in your organization do you think may be difficult to implement? Is it 20%, 40%, 60%, or perhaps 80%? So giving you some time to respond to this poll, probably leaving it up for 30 seconds to a minute. And I'll be very keen to see the results. Cassie, if you can put that. All right, so overwhelmingly people falling in the 20% to 40% range, with very little in 80% and a little bit in 60%. That's very interesting. So I acknowledge that this question would have warranted us to qualify difficult, which is what I'm going to do today, because I'd like you to consider these results. So when we reviewed 168 serious incidents, or examined the review of 168 serious incidents, the major finding of those reviews across industries were that 61% of critical controls were in some way difficult to implement for the workers performing the work. Now, what we mean by difficult to follow or implement, it can be because of the circumstances, the tools that you have available to you, the operating culture, or the physical context. I'll give you an example of difficult that illustrates the point. You need to use an elevated work platform for any task above 3 meters in this particular organization, but the groundwork that surrounds the area in which you're going to perform the task is really uneven, making it very difficult to use that safely, that EWP. That's an example. And if you think about it, if 61% of controls are difficult to implement, well, it's likely that people will find workarounds. And it's not surprising that in reviewing those incidents, we found that 49% of control failures involve intentional workarounds by workers. Now, there's probably a few things to pace when we look at that data. Is first, does that mean that 61% of critical controls are always difficult to implement in organization? Probably not. But in the context of incidents, it's usually a pretty good precursor. Does that mean that safety professionals aren't good at designing critical controls? I don't think so either. I think there's definitely a space for the SMEs in developing critical control programs. You need to be doing your bow ties and your fish bones, and the best people positioned to do that are going to be your SMEs type individuals. What I think this probably speaks to is the idea that once this is being implemented, we may not be getting safety professional the intel that we need to better the process or continuously improve what's being done at a local level. The other thing that we found through that review is probably what I would call two brutal facts. High-risk work and the controls that are needed are not fully effective or fully enabled. That relates to the previous idea. But we also found that local operational risk, which is the excessive risk tolerance at a local level, is usually driven by misaligned corporate systems. Now, we're not going to have the opportunity today to dive deep into the organizational factor that drive local tolerance to risk, but we thought it was worth calling it out. Now, what I found personally very fascinating and very interesting is when you overlay that incident data with some of the cultural data that we've been able to collect. And you may be familiar with our study Driving a Positive Safety Culture, in which we reviewed safety culture data from a very large sample of organization and a lot of individuals, so up to 21,000 survey completed and 600 hours of interviews. And the purpose of that study was to understand what are the key areas of opportunity across organization at a low level of maturity, and try to pinpoint what were the key levers that they could pull if they wanted to fast track their or accelerate their growth in terms of safety culture maturity. And that data actually overlays with incident data. Because when you look at the top 5 opportunities for safety culture dimensions, meaning organization in negative safety culture, what we found is that most often the perception of the quality of safety procedures was an opportunity. What we mean by that is the usability of safety procedures as perceived by the individuals using them. And that's back to that idea of work being enabled or easy to implement as opposed to difficult. We also found that management safety commitment, or the perception of management safety commitment, was an issue. And that idea also speaks to the level to which they're visible in field, or the level to which management is perceived to be in field talking about safety. Then comes internal context, which allegedly probably overlaps so nicely or well with that idea of misaligned corporate systems. Internal context is everything that relates to change management or the introduction of a new framework in the organization. We then have willingness to report incident and errors, which I'm pretty confident most safety professionals would agree that if we don't get good intel, it's really hard to make good decisions. Employee safety performances, which was an interesting one, which is the level to which effective safety behavior or positive safety behaviors are being considered in employees' performances. And one that I think is worth mentioning, but is not highlighted here, is the one that fell short of making top 5. Number 6 is the level with which people understand hazards in the organization and the way they control hazards. So very interesting finding from my perspective that the incident data we're getting overlays with the safety culture data. And I wanted to take us into a certain way with this particular presentation. And I thought it'd be worth sharing this quote from James Reason. That is, look, we cannot change the human condition, but we can change the condition in which people work. And what I think is missing, if you allow me to comment, is probably, yes, we can change the condition in which people work, but in order to do that well, we need to understand the human condition first very well. Which is why we thought it would be helpful to explore the psychology of risk today, especially applied to the context of critical control assurance. Now, before we dive into the psychology of risk, just a call out to the ability that humans have to see risk in the first place. There's a lot of limitation to the human brain that are worth understanding. There's our cognitive limitation that will impair our ability to perceive and see risk, such as inattentional blindness, our inability to see gradual changes, especially if they're slow in time. Think about corrosion, for instance, is something that the human brain is pretty slow to pick on. The limitation of our short-term working memory, you might have heard the concept that neuroscientists have coined as 7 units. That's the idea that we only have a very limited processing capacity. What that 7 units idea speaks to is, if I was to give you a shopping list vocally, you'd probably remember between 5 to 9 items, unless it was written somewhere else. It is also a litany of biases that humans have that come into play when it comes to perceiving risk. So that's one thing. There's also the skills and knowledge that we've been equipped with in understanding the risk exposure that we have as individuals. And that idea that I'm not going to be looking for something that I don't know about. And that's where inductions and the likes become very important in organization to help people understand and mitigate risk. Alertness, or the things that impact our level of alertness, such as fatigue, stress, prescription and non-prescription drugs, and all the things that alter our level of alertness, and things like preparation and work planning. Are we going to be rushing to finish the job, and what might that impact? Or how might that impact our attitudes and behaviors? Habituation, which we'll touch on shortly, in that idea of building risk tolerance over time, or what some people may call practical drift in other circumstances, and also the distraction that I brought onto a job. So while those are the things that will impair our ability to see risk in the first place, I also want to touch on the attitudes that people have around risk in the organization. And choosing to be a bit inflammatory here, but do we have an appreciation or respect for the risks that are involved in what we do every day? And I think most people would, but I think there's some tricks that your brain plays on you. The first time you walk onto a site, you see a lot of things that appear very dangerous to you. Day 1,200, it's fair to say that those things might seem not as dangerous as they once were. And look, the inherent risk hasn't changed, only your attitude or belief or interaction with it has. The other one is, do we have helpful attitude towards risk management tool, or do we see Tech 5s or SWIMs as just a tick in box exercise? And look, we're being cheeky here, but it's worth exploring people's attitude, because we know they contribute to the result they get in life, especially in the context of safety. And there's a model we use to talk about that idea at Sentis. It's what we call our ABR model. What this model proposes is that the way we think and feel about a particular thing is going to condition our behavior. And the behavior that we engage in will contribute to the results that we get in life. Now, probably fair to say, my belief conditions the things I do, and the things I do impact the results I get. But if the attitudes that underpin our actions are unhelpful to achieving the goal of safe outcomes at work or safe productive work, we're more likely to engage in unsafe behaviors, and that increases our risk of experiencing serious injury or a fatality event in the organization, especially if the collective attitudes around are shared, which some may call culture. Now, in the context of critical controls, I think it'd be helpful to overlay this with some common attitudes that we see in organization here. That idea that, you'll be all right, it won't happen to me. I know what the risk involved is, and nothing has ever gone wrong before. That could be at an individual level for workers, or leaders thinking, I'm too busy to go out policing people and telling them what to do. I trust my team. I know what they should be doing. I'm not going to go out there policing them. So it's not to say that those attitudes are bad attitudes. They could probably be unhelpful, Because if that's the attitude that underpins the way I navigate the workplace, and all of a sudden I'm starting to feel a lot of production pressure and pressure to get results quick as opposed to safely, the behavior I might choose to engage in is, all right, well, I'm going to bypass this particular control. I'm going to choose the workaround because I know it's going to get me quicker to my results. So I choose a shortcut, I choose a workaround, and the result that I'm going to get most of the time, in fact, is I got the job done quicker, which can reinforce the attitude that it's okay to do it. And the more I engage in those behavior over time, the more likely I'm to build an excessive tolerance to risk. Furthermore, workarounds also happen in the interest of time saving and workload reduction. We've established that, but over time that leads to what Snook describes as a slow, steady uncoupling of practice from routine procedure. And when that doesn't lead to incident, worker thinks it's okay and they keep engaging in that behavior. Now, what I'm saying here can sound a lot like blaming the worker for their attitude, which is absolutely not the case. In fact, I'd like to ask you a question about choosing a shortcut or workaround. Are workarounds always a bad thing? Are they always getting in the way of safe work? Well, I thought we'd tell you a quick story to illustrate this particular concept. So I'm going to make the assumption that most of you would have heard of the day man went to the moon, and you may have heard the name of Michael Collins, Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong. But there's probably a story beyond the big story that most of you have not heard of. And that's the story that I'm going to tell you today. So successful beginning to the Apollo 11 mission. We've collected our sample on the moon. Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong said those famous words. They're wrapping up and they're preparing to return to Earth. And they are now operating the lunar module called Eagle. And they're about to go for their last rest before the mission to go back to Columbia starts. And Buzz Aldrin lays down in the module and starts to see float around a piece of black plastic. And thinks to himself, that should be floating around. What is it? Investigates and realizes it's a circuit breaker that's broke out of the panel. Looks at it, goes to the panel, and realizes that it's the one that's associated to those 6 letters, ARMENG, which is ARM engine. So what Buzz Aldrin is realizing slowly is that he can't fire up the engine to go back to Columbia. So he's stuck on the moon and he's got 8 hours of oxygen to go. So calls Houston and tells them he has a problem. And Houston replies, don't worry about it. We've got you. Go to bed. We'll get back to you in 6 hours before the mission starts and tell you what to do. So Buzz Aldrin goes to bed, a bit uneasy, wakes up 2 hours before liftoff, and Houston tells him, we don't have a solution for you. We don't know what to do. So what does Buzz Aldrin decide to do? Well, think about a workaround to get this lunar module off the moon. And what he ends up doing is grabbing one of his pen, wedging it into the panel, stucking it in place, and eventually fires off those engines and goes back to Columbia to meet Michael Collins and does so safely. And it sounds crazy, but it's actually what he did. And you can see this pen here on the picture is the actual pen that he used, and it's in the museum, the NASA museum, and the dent you can see in the pen is the wedge. So why am I telling you this story? Well, it's probably to make the point of the human ingenuity. So I said earlier that when you introduce humans into a control, you introduce variability, and therefore they become less reliable. We've also said that an unhelpful attitude over time could create more risk. What I really wanted to hammer home as well was to say that people can make situations safer, especially when the rule or work as imagined doesn't suit work as done, meaning the new circumstances in which people find themselves. And if you look at the investigation that took place after this event, what they realized was they had a lot of routine procedure for what they had anticipated could go wrong, which was in that case the lunar module being able to dock back into Columbia. But they'd never imagined that they would get stuck on the moon. So they had no fail-safe mechanism or no written procedures or ground rule to do that safely in case that happened. So that particular workaround led to much safer outcomes. In fact, it saved the day. And the call that I have for probably safety specialists out there is, how are you learning from workarounds? Are you actually examining them? Do you hear from them in the first place? And are you able to learn how to make your control less difficult to implement or more enable worker to do the work better? And I think it's crucial to learn from those workarounds as opposed to blaming people when they choose to make a different choice, because most of the time work goes well. To wrap this section up, probably wanted to use this quote from ICMM again: behavioral and procedural controls are here to stay. Therefore, there's a need to make sure their inherent frailty is understood. This includes an increased understanding of social, psychological, organizational, culture, and culture change, as well as an appreciation of human error and reliance. So this means we need to understand humans to be able to better influence them or design systems that suit the way we operate. And there's one particular person that can do that well every day, and it's probably the operational leader. And I'd like to look at the role of the leader in influencing critical or critical control assurance, essentially. Before we explore this, we like to ask questions at Sentis, and I'd like to ask you another one today, and let's take another quick poll. Looking back on incidents and incident data, which of these local factors do you believe most contribute to events occurring? Is it the excessive tolerance to risk that people may have, inadequate supervision, the tolerance of poor systems, or equipment failure? So again, giving you 30 seconds to a minute to fill that poll. Share your opinion. All right, let's close the poll, Kathy, if you don't mind, and see those results. Always really excited to see the result. Really interesting. So we've got a pretty even spread with two contender. Excessive risk tolerance, I think, is the winner by 1%, followed by tolerance of poor systems, inadequate supervision, and last but not least, equipment failure. Very interesting results. I propose that we look at what the data says. So when we reviewed those incidents, or when we look at that review of incident, what we found was what follows. At a local level, so notwithstanding we mentioned there is organizational factors that will influence those local factors, but when we look at a local level, the reason, or one of the most common reason why incident occurred is because of inadequate supervision first, excessive risk tolerance as follows, the tolerance of poor system, a high value on time saving, and rules or procedures being outdated. Now, I'm going to explain what we mean by each of those top 5 terms, probably, as opposed to going into all of those in an iterative fashion. But what inadequate supervision relates to is the idea that both capacity of the leaders to supervise or their capability aren't up to scratch. A good example or a statement that would summarize this is, we didn't see many supervisors before on the floor, but now there's been a restructure and we hardly ever see them. And to be honest, if we see them, they're not much help. These are real things that we've heard, just to be clear. And it's the idea that, well, if you're one supervisor looking after 10 different teams in different sites, which sometimes happens, it's pretty much a capacity issue. But if you're not clear on what the risk of your business are, that's probably a capability issue. So that's both these things that we weigh in inadequate supervision. Excessive risk tolerance is pretty self-explanatory. It's that idea that we've explored earlier. An example that I've seen recently with a client that pretty much addressed this excessive risk tolerance would be, we've got a forklift, and when we did the inspection, it was pretty hit and miss. It was okay, but we tagged it out because it was safe to do. But now we've got 2 machines that are actually broken. They've been tagged out, and we're under the pump. So that tagged out forklift, well, we're not going to say to anyone what we do, but we're going to grab it and use it because it's just a sticky lever. So that would be a good example of excessive risk tolerance. Tolerance of both systems. The best way to summarize this will be we've got a control verification program in place, and it's a really clumsy app. We can't really collect data the way we would want it to, but you know what? It makes do. And it's been on the back burner to upgrade that system for about 2 years, but we've been working with it, and so therefore it's not perceived to be a problem by anyone because we can go by, so we choose to go by. That's a good example of tolerance-able system. High value on time saving, very self-explanatory. I'm not going to go too much into it, but get the job done quickly as opposed to safely. And rules procedure being outdated. That's pretty common. Another example using the forklifts, because those are the things that terrify me these days, forklifts, that I've seen recently is procurement finally came through. We've got the new forklift we've been asking for, brand new machine, and I go about using it, and I get on the machine, look at it, and realize I'm not too sure how to use it. It looks a lot like the old one, but it's not. I go look at the procedure, and the procedure that I've got in the manual is still for the old brand that we just got rid of. So that would be a good example of rural procedures being outdated. And then we've got complacency, maintenance failure, inadequate planning, and so on. But the reason we really wanted to share those with you today is probably because when we look at the top 2 that are probably the most significant contributors, they relate directly to a person or leadership component of safety culture. And the idea that if we can greatly influence those 2, we can reduce the risk exposure of a business is pretty evident here. So we want to look at the influence that the leaders have in mitigating risk for organization at a local level, especially because that's where most operational leaders find themselves. So leaders really set the tone and help shape the environment in which high risk work is being performed. They are the role models that people are going to look up to. You know, what the standard you work past, the standard you accept, or what you've all heard that, and that's the idea here, that they will shape and influence the attitudes and behavior in the organization around managing risk. And their own tolerance to risk is essential in promoting effective critical control. So how do you define good leadership? What does good look like in the context of effective safety leadership? At Sentis, we use this model that we call the 8 safety leadership competencies. Now, those are models of, just to give you a bit of background on this particular model of safety leadership are a very useful framework to develop good quality behaviors in the organization. There's numerous models out there that are mostly leadership based, and what we realize in the context of safety is that there's a certain mix of skill that's required, and they probably require both transactional leadership skills and transformational leadership skills. And when it comes to an effective leaders in the context of supporting critical control assurance, a combination of both those skills is very much required, because that ensures an appropriate balance between compliance-based safety leadership, where leaders set the standards regarding the implementation and verification of critical control, supervises high-risk works, and hold workers to account, but also transformational safety leadership skills, where leaders collaborate with workers, invite them to think differently about safety, and role model effective safety leadership behaviors. So if we were trying to map those 8 safety leadership competencies against the concept of critical risk management, we probably see something like this. So supporting would be a more transactional competencies, whereby we ensure that people know what's expected of them and we make sure they follow through on it. That's very important in the context of critical control implementation and critical control assurance. That's the idea of active supervision of high-risk work and verification in fields being done well. Recognizing is also a transactional competencies, often misunderstood. And that's the idea that I'm going to choose to reward my team member with a verbally or in any other fashion for demonstrating effective safety leadership behaviors or safety behaviors in general. So if I've done the right thing in the context of safety, I'm being recognized for doing so, which is something that organizations allegedly don't do very well. Most people here, why aren't you wearing the correct set of PPE for this particular task, as opposed to thank you for ensuring that you wore the right equipment to perform this. And it leads to people feeling that safety is about catching people doing the wrong thing, as opposed to recognizing people for doing the right thing. Active care is probably the other one that needs to be factored in. That's the idea that not only do I genuinely care for the health, safety, and well-being of my people, but I'm able to demonstrate that effectively in my communication style. Collaboration, that's the idea that I'm going to share ownership of safety outcomes with my team, consult with them on how to do things in a safer, better way, and involve them in the safety decision-making process, and enable better critical controls as a result, better implementation of critical controls. The idea of vision. Vision is the idea that I can articulate the organizational safety vision in a meaningful, compelling way, in the sense that I can link it to what people do every day, which is different from inspiring being the ability to generate buy-in or engagement around that particular safety vision. Probably worth mentioning, inspiring is different from being charismatic. You don't have to be charismatic to be able to inspire people. Role models, self-explanatory, and role model safety compliant behaviors in the context of implementing critical control, and I do that consistently. I set the benchmark for what good looks like. Challenging is I'm able to challenge my team and people in my team to think differently about how we can best manage high-risk work. Usually a good leader as a challenger is someone that uses very compelling questions that trigger a challenge of people's belief or perspective on a particular task. Now, and if that is the framework, those 8 SLCs for how you influence well as a leader, there's a few touch points that leaders can leverage or that are best suited for influencing the workforce. Pre-starts are absolutely crucial. A great pre-start will switch on your people to look out for the risks that are going to be out there today, and also help them understand what's expected of them. It's a very good medium. Every other meeting that you have around safety is a good medium to start influencing people to think about the critical risks they're going to have to manage and what they can control to do so. Any formal safety interaction or informal safety interaction is a very good medium to influence mindsets. And we find that, unfortunately, in organization, they're often perceived to be a witch hunt as opposed to a helpful safety conversation that can be a two-way learning process. All your communication means are good to reinforce that attention density as well. Closing the feedback loop when someone reports a hazard, if an improvement is being done, returning back to those people and letting them know that we are improving a process based on their feedback is very important to keeping that reporting coming through. Event notifications, and investigations, and work planning. Work planning is actually it's way before the fact, but it's very important. If you know you're going to have periods of pressure, do you have the same amount of supervisor in field? And if not, are you setting yourself up for failure by not having that adequate supervision capacity that we've touched on earlier? To circle back on the psychology of risk, the role of the leader is essentially to influence the attitudes of the workforce and colleagues when it comes to managing critical risk. By challenging attitude, we can hope to improve the behaviors, the thing that people say and do, and hope to achieve safe, productive work as a result. So some practical tips. What can you actually do tomorrow or start doing differently to get some better results in that space? Well, first, we will encourage every operational leader out there to understand well the risk profile of the organization and know the controls that exist for high risk activities well. Because your role in validating and verifying the presence of controls is pretty critical to use, or crucial to use a better word. And your in-field interaction will shape the way then people go about doing that themselves. So really good starting point is that do you actually have a very good understanding of what the risks are and how they should be controlled? And share that knowledge with people around you if you do, because it's actually pretty valuable for workers to understand that too. Second is we say take the time to plan and implement the controls that you need to have in there. So ensure your team is enabled, first of all, and back to that idea of the control shouldn't be difficult to implement. And what I think is particularly interesting in that second point is that idea of start work authority. You would have all heard of a stop work authority, and look, don't get me wrong, there's absolutely a place for them. They should definitely exist. People should be enabled to stop work when something's about to go wrong to make sure no one gets injured. But it is a very reactive way of looking at things. What about a start work authority? Something that we would need to have all the controls in place before we can even start the work. And if you're familiar with Paul O'Neill, ex-CEO of Alcoa, late Paul O'Neill, he was talking of the idea of safety as a precondition as opposed to safety as a priority. And I think this is a very good practical way to start creating safety as a precondition to work by creating those concepts such as start work authority. Last, incorporating feedback and learning and refocusing mechanism through pre-starts again. That's probably the best vector to do that, but to take the time for people to think about what they're going to implement that day. Now, that's all well and good, but there's probably some continuous improvement that needs to be factored in as well. And there's some operational strategies for you here. So I'm not sure if you've heard of the concept of early, often, ugly, it's okay. I find this a very compelling way to look at continuous improvement. It comes from the Silicon Valley and tech companies. What they mean by that is if there's a problem when we're building a software, we need to know about it early. We want people to tell us early as often as possible. And sometime it might get ugly, right? It might lead to a very uncomfortable situation, but it's actually okay because long term, that's what's going to be more beneficial for our organization in the context of building a non-buggy software, for instance. And I think it's very applicable to the context of safety. If there's something that's potentially an issue, we want to know about it very early on. We want our people to talk about it as often as possible. And sometimes we're not going to like what we find out. So, we've got a critical control that's not working, or we're going to have to stop work. But that's actually okay because it's going to streamline things down the line and it's going to make sure we work safely. The other thing is celebrating good catches. It's very important to celebrate things that your worker bring to you that are going to lead to an improvement and make a lot of noise about it, because if people see that it's being recognized, they're more likely to engage into it. And if you want to promote a reporting culture, celebrating those good reports that help you improve your organization is very key. Learn your weak signals. When we talk about weak signals, we talk about those precursors of serious incidents that can fly under the radar, right? And explore them. So weak signals can be found in workarounds, and it's important to really well understand what they are because they can become a very good indicator of a potential risk arising. Another very practical way to learn from what's working in the organization is a de-identified voluntary anonymous observation or audit in which you will look for what's working well. And that idea stems from probably something that I've seen recently done in the aviation industry, where the conundrum that people ask, or the question that people ask themselves is, how do you keep learning proactively when, in essence, there's not that many incidents we experience? A commercial flight's supposed to go well, and while they may be able to learn from potential incidents, when there's less data incoming, how do you start learning? And I think it's American Airlines that had a team called the LEAT team, the Learning Improvement Team, that looked at improving safety performances from a different lens, which was having a group of people that did audits around what is working well, what makes your crew more effective, what makes a captain a better leader, what makes a flight more successful. I think it was a very compelling way to look at improving safety from what's working really well and what's already in place. And the way they decided to do that was through a voluntary process where everyone, what everything that would be shared would remain anonymous and would be de-identified, which is most existing processes nowadays. But nevertheless, the lens of looking at what's working well I thought was very compelling in order to seek a different data stream to look at how we can improve what we do. And the last thing I probably would encourage you to do is look at your historical data and understand the story it's telling you. If you look back in the review mirror and you look at your incident data, what is it actually telling you? Are you looking at it from the right angles to get the data that you need to understand where your risks are? So those are probably the things we invite you to reflect on today. We're now going to jump into Q&As. We have had a lot of questions come through before the webinar, so we'll be focusing on replying to those early on. Cassie, probably over to you before we jump into questions.
Yeah, okay. Thanks very much, Thibaut. Yeah, as you said, we've had a lot of pre-questions and we've also had a couple come through. So we'll do our best to get through, and any that we don't get to, we'll come back to afterwards. But kicking off, question number 1, this question is around ownership and improvement. HSE tends to take the ownership of its process early, but we find quickly that we don't have access to the resources, the people and the knowledge, etc., to make it real and continuously improve. How do other companies do this?
That's a very good question. And I'm going to try to answer it in a short and as compelling way as possible. Look, first of all, absolutely want to acknowledge again that the HSE function is critical. They're critical enablers because they usually have a system approach to doing things. But ultimately, critical risks are being managed at the front end, right, by people doing the work. So what I've probably seen organizations that are more mature in that space do well is probably start managing critical risk from where the individual is most exposed and work backwards once the critical controls have been implemented. And there's a few things that are critical in ensuring that's possible. There's probably some leadership alignment that's required, and that leadership alignment is better created when informed by data and reliable data. So what I'm getting at is if you want to have this continuous improvement facilitated in your organization, you need to have good data that fosters leadership alignment so that we can work on the implementation of those control in the real world or from a work as done perspective, I guess. And what real mature organizations do is they probably overlay 2 different streams of data. One is your historical incident data, so what you've seen through your incident, where is your high potential, what are your weak signals, and things that they know, overlaid with probably a more proactive stream of data that would be your critical control in-field data, and they overlay that into a cohesive dashboard that gives you a better idea and a better lens on what your risk profile is essentially. And if you've got that, that usually enables alignment and that enables improvement, is my experience. I hope that answers that question.
All right, next question are there examples of genuine lead indicators to high risk hazardous situations emerging?
Again, that's a very, very good question. Is there a lead indicator that's common across industry? Probably to some extent. Some things like potential and near misses when it comes to looking at your critical risk. If you've got a good understanding again of your weak signal and potential and how often that occurs, it's probably a good indicator of probably something, good precursors to what could be happening. You could also say a good lead indicator would be, if you know what is your last line of defense that fails most commonly, and you understand why it's failing commonly, then it's probably a good precursor to anything that could be occurring. I hope that helps.
Next question, how can we encourage team members to speak up about the dumb or nonsensical rules still in play from the past that need to be reviewed, rather than everyone knowing that no one does step 4 anymore until that event happens and in discussions referring to the procedure policy comes out?
Yeah, well, look, it's probably linking directly back to that idea that there's a drift in practices because people feel that step 4 in that particular instance is not relevant. So how do we encourage team members to speak up about those rules? First, understanding if that rule is enabling work is probably going to be key. Does that rule make work difficult, or is there a very good reason for why that rule is here in place and people have chosen not to do step 4 because over time they've built risk tolerance to it? So understanding these nuances will be very key. The best way to influence people to speak up is probably to encourage reporting by fostering a learning culture where when someone brings it early often, and it might get ugly, we actually recognize that as valuable behaviors that we want to reinforce. Because if every time I suggest an improvement, I'm being shut down, then it's likely that people over time will just operate from the attitude that their opinion isn't valued, and therefore they wouldn't be raising any concern if they saw one. So celebrating loud fixes and good catches will help create or empower people to feel enabled to speak up.
Thank you. Next question is, can one assess the climate in critical risk management and what would we measure?
Very good question again. Yes, you can. You can measure critical risk management climate. This would include, if you measure it in a survey fashion, key aspects like probably high potential incident classification, the degree to which people understand processes around high risk activities, if leadership understands the supervision, of high risk tasks, people's willingness to learn from serious potential events would be something you'd want to understand, and their willingness to raise concern again or stop work we're conducting high risk work. So all those things are going to be pretty crucial in understanding how critical risk climate plays out in the organization.
Okay, next one is how do we create an effective risk management culture? What's the roadmap to get there?
That's a very, very broad question and a very, very good question. And I'm going to try to, again, respond to that pretty succinct, in a succinct fashion. Creating an effective risk management culture, my strong, intimate belief is that it has to come from leaders and the way they look at risk at an individual level across the organization, and you want that to be harmonious. So you would want a fairly strong harmony around the way people manage risk, and you want that to be pretty positive, right? So you want your leaders to have consistently displayed the same risk tolerance, and that should be probably low, and have an effective way of managing risk across the organization so that they can influence the workforce. And you usually see repercussions in where other people behave when all leaders behave in harmony. The roadmap to get there is probably going to be very different for a lot of different organizations, because you'd have inherently different problem, and probably what you find in the context of building culture is that there's a lot of not so uncommon challenges in organizations, but they're in a very unique set of circumstances. So you'll have probably a low safety involvement from the workforce, but you'd find that these are driven by different circumstances. So the best way to understand what the roadmap would look like is probably to go look under the hood and gather data to inform the roadmap that's going to be fit for purpose. So climate surveys, safety culture diagnostics, incident investigation data being reviewed, all those things are going to help inform your thinking probably.
Thank you. Next is, do you think there is a more relatable name for critical risk? Have you seen organisations call it something else?
Critical control assurance. It's probably what my response will be. Look, start work authority as opposed to stop work authority is another good one. I still think that the name critical risk needs to be thrown out around for a few reasons. I think that where we see organization being successful again is when there's a strong leadership alignment around what the big problems or critical risks that we need to manage are in the organization. And I think the calling it critical risk help facilitate the conversation with people that don't necessarily have a strong safety acumen. But I understand how it can be creating threat responses at an employee or individual level, which is why you want to gear things towards control or the way we can create control assurance, because it feels a lot more in your control. So I think critical risk management serves the purpose of aligning people that make decision and help them understand what we're trying to do when influencing the workforce. Gearing the conversation towards the control and what they can control is probably more helpful to create engagement.
Next question is, what is the surest way to stringently motivate workers to use these rules, procedures and standards for safe work when nobody is considered to be looking at their job? Is it better to write these documents in a how to get the job done, or still write them in a safety process, then train them into the company endorsed safety process?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in that question, and what I'm going to choose to focus on is really what's the surest way to intrinsically, I think that was, motivate workers to engage in safety compliant behavior is essentially what I've understood. This is probably best achieved if we can help people understand why we do safety in the first place and give them a compelling reason for why it matters to them as individuals. So you really want to target those attitudes, because as you mentioned rightfully, I think in this question is people might engage in the behaviors that you want when they're being watched, right? They might say and do what they're supposed to when leaders are around, but they might revert back to old habits or their existing behaviors when no one's watching. The only way you can really mitigate that is by influencing their belief and their attitude around safety. So you want to be able to leverage intrinsic motivators, that are universal, so family, and everyone wants to go home safe to their family, and safety is a pretty compelling vessel to do so. So you want to be targeting people's beliefs around safety to enable the behavior that you want when no one's watching. That was a really good question too. I think we're running a little bit out of time, Cassie, so I'm probably going to jump to the next slide.
Yes, yeah. We'll get back to anybody who has asked any other questions.
Probably, right. So if you want to understand what your critical risk climate could be in your organization, a good way to do this is by gathering information and data to get the right intel to guide your decision making, right? Remembering that at the end of the day, 99% of the work goes well, so we need multiple sources of data to understand how to improve it. We have safety climate surveys that can measure critical risk climate, so please express your interest, yes or no, by responding to the poll if that's something you'd like to explore. Probably go to the next one, Kathy. Now, we also have the capability to measure or to review your historical incident to understand the story that your data is telling you. We call this a meta-incident analysis. What it will help you do is explore your historical incidents, understand if your incident classification is giving you the accurate picture that guides your decision making. What we found is a lot of incidents fly under the radar, incident that is with high potential, and therefore scarce resources in organization are geared toward high frequency incidents as opposed to high potential. So understanding where's your high potential and how to best manage it can be uncovered that way. So express your interest. Should you be? And before we wrap up for today, just wanted to say thank you to all of you who attended today. I hope you found today's presentation useful. If you have any question, you're more than welcome to get in touch. You can see my contact detail on the screen here, and I'd be happy to entertain a conversation and help you create a positive safety culture in your workplace. Over to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Thibaut. And on behalf of Centus, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Our next webinar is titled Understanding Culture, Climate and Engagement, Choosing the Right Survey for Your Business. And that'll be delivered on Thursday, the 12th of May. So we hope you can join us then. Until then, stay safe, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.